addressing regional mobility issues within the South Orange County area. The goal of this survey was to gather information regarding the public's perceptions, concerns, and desires related to solving South Orange County's traffic congestion, and was conducted countywide in an effort to understand the regional mobility implications. Jeff Corliss of Venture Strategic will now provide a brief summary of the survey and research data, as well as introduce Dr. Val Smith and Barakat Khalil from Smith Johnson Research to provide the top line results. Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman, Mr. Chairman, and members of the Board of Directors. I'm Jeff Corliss with Venture Strategic, strategic communications consultant in the South Orange County traffic relief effort. As you all know, I wanted to just describe briefly for you the nexus for conducting this research on this project. And just reviewing, just over 2 years ago, we began a public outreach process, very robust, formal outreach effort that included more than 2 years of stakeholder and public outreach to the community, to stakeholders, to elected officials. It included the South Orange County Mobility Working Group. It also included several forums and also online outreach to communicate with the public, to talk about the need for traffic relief in the South Orange County region, as well as solicit their ideas to how we best solve traffic congestion in the region. Doing so, there were a number of ideas, as you all know, that were received from the public and from elected officials, 20 ideas, and as you've heard from Mr. Carr, the sorting document reviewed how those are being public process. Following that, what we felt was important is to measure the actual scientific sentiment of the public, to understand that in addition to all of the comments, all of the ideas, all of the feedback, and the input through that process, to validate and understand that is the true sentiment of the public, is to survey the public through a countywide transportation initiatives public opinion survey. That research was conducted by Smith Johnson Research, who is a part of our team. Dr. Val Smith has nearly 40 years of experience as a statistician and a researcher in public opinion surveys. Dr. Smith and his team put together an extensive survey that included asking people about their experiences with traffic, as well as understanding their views on the various ideas that were brought forward, particularly those that we focused on that are within the TCA's purview. So I want to turn it over to Dr. Val Smith and Barakat Khalil from Smith Johnson Research, who are going to walk you through the methodology of that survey, and also the questions that we asked and the results of the survey, and why the way in which the survey was conducted is important, and what that means in terms of how we move forward. Dr. Smith.
Good afternoon. My name is Barakat Khalil. I'm with Smith Johnson Research, and I wanted to just briefly go over the methodology with you, just to kind of give you a little bit of context in terms of how the survey was structured. And one thing I'll say before I get into that is that our research objective was to, as Jeff was saying, to clearly understand what public opinion was on this issue. And so our goal is accurate measurement of opinion on transportation issues. So with that being said, the survey was conducted in 2 parts. There's a base sample of 1,000 live phone interviews across the county that was stratified by supervisor district. So there were 200 respondents from each supervisor district. And then we had an oversample of about 590 interviews that were conducted online from 3 cities in the South County region, San Juan Capistrano, Dana Point, and San Clemente. The interviews were conducted middle of August, as you can see there. And the sampling error we have for that is plus or minus 3.1%, and that's on the base sample. Now, as you go through the slides, you'll see data for the whole survey, and that includes the oversample, but weighted back to its proportion of the county's population. So even though we did get these 600 interviews from the South County region, we weighted it back so that everything would still be in balance and wouldn't skew the data. But we have that oversample there available when we get to the questions that were asked specifically to those residents that live there. So we have enough sample for statistical analysis. And we also conducted some pre-tests at the front end of the field work in order just to ensure that the questions were clear and that there weren't any particular issues with how they were worded, because it is a very technical topic, and we were always concerned about making sure that the questions were clear and concise, especially given that many of the phone interviews were conducted over the phone. So the respondents have to listen to this audibly and be able to process what they're hearing and then make a judgment and answer the questions that we're posing them. And Dr. Valsmith will go into the rest of the survey analysis.
Right, thank you. Thank you. The way the survey was organized, and typical of this kind of a survey, we start very broad with the broader topic of transportation, congestion, and measuring some psychographic variables. Then as the survey progresses, we narrow it down. And the reason we do this is so that we don't overly or unnecessarily prejudice any subsequent questions. So we don't give them any specific information and then come back and ask general questions without some purpose. And then towards the end of the survey, we will pick up additional demographic and psychographic variables to analyze and see what is actually predictive of the results that we obtain. Okay, we started off with some questions, and now let me just kind of preview some of the issues that we kind of confront here. The voters that we looked at were by and large interested in the topic. They took it seriously. We had a uniformly low number of undecided answers or no opinion types of answers. This was in part due to the fact that we were dealing with a topic that had interest for them and that they had some knowledge of. However, obviously we were broaching things that were technical, things that we had to provide some information. And we need to appreciate the fact that these are people who were not thinking about this issue before we called. They had some investment in the issue typically, but these were not people, we were almost as like we're catching them off guard in terms of thinking about the issue. So the task in front of people here is that they have to hear the question, they have to assimilate the information, they have to form a defensible answer to whatever the question is we give them. And it's done through, the base sample in particular is being done through an entirely auditory over the phone. So it tends to be a bit of a dense survey. So typical of this type of survey, we do a number of things to make it sort of, if you would, readable for them. And one is that we are going to use a number of labels. The reason we arrive at these labels is so we can come back to the same referent repeatedly, that they can get comfortable with these labels, but also we can append to the label a fair amount of information. So it becomes a very careful balancing act between too much information and information that is just too rangy for them to handle. They're doing all this at the same time that most people are kind of hypothesis testing about us. They're thinking, okay, who's doing this survey? What are they doing this survey for? Are they representing one side or the other? All that's going through their mind at the same time that they're trying to answer these questions. So we spent a great deal of time, massaging, looking at, editing these questions. We went through a number of drafts in the double figures, number of drafts of the survey till we thought we had the right balance that people could understand the questions and give us honest answers. And we're quite convinced that we accomplished that. We had very few people ask for questions to be reread. We had a very low number of undecideds, as I mentioned, and people were able to answer the questions. So we're very confident that we had a survey that yielded reliable results and pretty valid. So we went through some preliminary information with them, and then we went through a number of options. And one of the options we listed as through pass, and that was referenced earlier in comments. So let me tell you why we arrived at this term. We didn't want, we wanted a reference, we wanted a label for this one of the four options that would be easily understood, would be descriptive, wouldn't bring with it additional prejudicial information. We didn't want it too general, so we didn't just refer to it as a toll road. And we wanted something that conveyed the idea that sort of made it easy for them to understand that this was going to be a road that would drop down into the median, travel through San Clemente without any exits, and go all the way to the San Diego border without any off-ramps, on-ramps into this toll road portion. So that's why we arrived at the label through pass. We also thought it would be comfortable in measures of traffic. Obviously, people are familiar with overpass and excuse me, overpass, underpass, you know, other kinds of language that would make it easy for them. So one of the four options that we went through was, one was the through pass, which is the idea number 14. And we went through an operational definition with them on the phone, and you can read it there. One suggestion would be to extend the 241 toll road. So we began with noting that this was an extension of the 241. There was no attempt to conceal that with some kind of label, using a through pass. And here we introduced a term that no one had ever heard of before. We invented it. That would run down through the median of I-5 into dedicated express lanes similar to the 91 freeway. So now they have an analogy to relate it to. The through pass would then run down from the foothills east of San Juan Capistrano, underneath Avenida La Plata and Vista Hermosa, cross over Avenida Pico in San Clemente, and drop into the dedicated lanes in the median between the north and southbound lanes of I-5, continuing south to the county line before merging with I-5. So we think they were able to understand what we were talking about.
Excuse me.
Now, all four of these options.
Excuse me,
I'm
Director
sorry.
Ward, did you have something to say?
Yeah, sometimes we need to ask you a question while you're on this
That's fine.
topic. So, this is exactly what you read to the people so that they could understand what a through pass was.
Yes.
Okay, in your other comments, you said you didn't want anyone to be misunderstood what it was, and that this would be something that would have no on-ramps or off-ramps, no exits, no anything like that. It would just run through the 5.
In San Clemente.
That is not in this definition. So was that conveyed to the people on the phone that there would be no on-ramps, no exits, none of that? So that they would understand what a through pass is. I understand you invented the term and you were trying to figure out what that would be. But that definition of not having exits or on-ramps is not in this definition. So I just want to make it clear. Was it clear to the people on the phone there was no exits or on-ramps or not?
Well, I would hope that what they understood was the phrase that it dedicated lanes continuing south to the county line before merging with 5.
Okay.
So they couldn't use a 5 exit And we also gave them no indication that there would be any on-ramp or off-ramp. Now, that's something that could be modified down the road, but we did not give them that information. We also wanted to make it clear that this wasn't just going to be a straight connector or merging with I-5 there at Pico. Now, all four of these options, we tried to give them both positives and negatives with each of the options. We do this for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to be fair. Second, when I do a survey, I know we've done a very good survey. If people who hear the survey don't know if it's for the merger or the extension of 241 or against the extension of 241, then I know I've got a nice balanced survey. And also, another reason we give both sides before we ask them the operative question is that some people are inclined to sort of be nice. I'm married to a woman who's kind of like that. You know, I don't understand where that comes from, but she's kind of nice and she wouldn't want to offend the person she's talking to. So we want to make it acceptable to give an honest opinion. So we want to make it comfortable for them. If they're opposed to this, we want them to be able to say, yes, I'm opposed to it, and we give them that excuse. If they're for it, we want to be able to give them that rationale. So we give them both sides, and we took these from what we believe to be the operative rhetoric at the time, for the most part, or the most salient arguments. So we gave everybody positives and negatives, and we said the advantage of the through pass is that it would not add to any traffic or I-5 or local streets. And again, that goes to your question. It would relieve the I-5 traffic and serve as an emergency access route for northbound and southbound traffic in South Orange County. The disadvantage would be that the construction would be over the objection of some San Clemente residents who say this would divide their community. Then we pause, the interviewer pauses, and then ask the operative question. Is this option desirable, acceptable, or not desirable? And here we're looking at the analysis and we're saying, okay, clearly the desirable is the positive answer. Clearly the not desirable is the negative answer. We can build a ratio or an index off contrasting those two extremes, but for those people that are kind of in the middle, we can say, is this acceptable? And we can later interpret that however we want with the language, but this gives people three options. So we did this with every item in the block. So we asked we used the same format, and then we went on to the Beltway, what we called the Beltway option.
Before you leave that last slide, I just had a quick question. And just to follow up, I was going to ask you how you came to the point of the through pass, because that is important, because it is a term that people are used to. But in all these questions here, nowhere do you say this is going to cost money though for you to take this new section.
Excuse me?
I mean, there's going to be a cost to this for people to write it. Is that not true? If the pass goes through, is that correct?
Well, there's a lot of detail and a lot of technical information and a lot of background information we could have given. But as you look at the question and you imagine, okay, they've got to sit there while this is being read, we can't give them everything.
Well, the only reason I asked that is years ago that there was a proposal to put a light rail all the way through Orange County. And I think that through that process, 80% of folks supported that concept. But then when you put a ticket price to it, the support went way down. So I'm just saying, so that we're fair and transparent when we're asking these questions, clearly if we say that it's emergency access route, but the point is I think we need to let people know, but this obviously is something that's going to cost you to get on it and eventually get off of it. And to me, I think that's a pretty big point, because sometimes I can't drive the toll road because it tends to get expensive if I did it every day. If my company paid for it, it's a different story, and many businesses do. So it seems like a critical point. I just didn't know why you didn't bring that up.
Well, when we reference it as a toll road, implying that there would be a toll, but you're absolutely right, okay? There's a lot of detail, there's a lot more arguments that should be pursued in detail, and the obvious remedy to this, without sounding too self-serving, is to do follow-up surveys with more detailed information. Fact is that TCA just can't do enough surveys with competent survey firms, so that would be my recommendation going forward, given the necessity of more detail.
Dr. Smith, would you say your opening line here, which was extend the 241 toll road, was it the assumption that if you open it with that line, extend the 240 toll road, that people would assume that it would mean the next segment would be toll? Was that one reason you didn't add further detail?
Well, again, we could have gone into cost, and then it becomes a question of the details. If I was doing a block of questions, and this is, on the serious side, this would be part of the rationale for doing additional survey work, we would go through a number of arguments in detail for it, and a number of arguments against it, and then come back and test the operative question again. And we could even look at alternative ways of broaching that cost. I mean, we could make the brief argument that will be largely paid for with tolls. We could also get into more esoteric alternative where we talk about bonds and those kinds of things. But we can't measure everything in a survey. Because one of the things that I do not do in my surveys is I do not fatigue the respondents. There's the long form surveys that some of my competitors use. I don't. I get them in, out, 15, 18 minutes, maybe 20 if they're really into the topic. And this was on the short side. So, again, it's all about trade-offs when you're trying to make these kinds of measurements. And we can't measure everything. So we didn't. But what we didn't measure, it would be fair to say, that's something that we need more information on in the future. We had the another option, and these were presented in random order, no particular order for all of the respondents. We have the technology to randomize these, so everyone would get them in a different order. Was what we called the Beltway option. And that's one suggestion would be a toll road running east and west, connecting the 241 and 73 toll roads. It would connect the communities of Rancho Mission Viejo, Ladera Ranch, and San Juan Capistrano. The advantage of this east-west beltway would be the extension of the 241 toll road to the 73 toll road, connecting residential areas with job centers. The disadvantage is that it would do nothing to relieve north and southbound traffic congestion on the I-5 bottleneck near San Clemente, and it would require the use of eminent domain and take many homes and businesses. Is this option desirable, acceptable, or not desirable? So that was the second option. You'll see how that tests in a moment.
Dr. Smith, can you go back to that slide?
I'm sorry, Director Ward, did you just?
Can you go back to the other slide? Okay. Who told you that a connection in east-west beltway would do nothing to relieve northbound and southbound traffic congestion on I-5?
Well, I sort of intuited that from the fact that it is not, that it just simply empties back out onto the 5. So if the traffic that's coming from the northeast and intends to go, for example, to San Diego, it would still have to come onto the 5, come down to San Diego. And then this survey was reviewed by other people on my staff and the client. So that was my reasoning.
Okay, so you were not informed of a prior OCTA study on the Beltway option that did take cars off the I-5? You were not provided that information from TCA?
Honestly, I don't know how it would take them off the 5.
Okay.
If anything, it seems intuitive that it would add to the 5 if someone's going south.
If they're going south, I'll agree. Okay, thank you.
I think
Those are my
those,
questions.
I don't need to speak for OCTA, I mean, Director Murphy can respond. I think the east-west beltway has always been viewed to be an internal circulation necessarily safe north south.
I've seen the, past studies on OCTA, and that's why it was suggested as even an arterial, because it did remove cars off I-5. So I just wanted to know, whether that was taken into consideration, and you answered my question.
Yeah, just quickly, yeah, I appreciate that we stay within, I mean, the questions are very much appreciated. But to be pushing, one route that I know Ms. Ward is pushing the Beltway, and suggested that's infringing upon Ladera Ranch and Mount San Juan Capistrano. I think that what we're trying to do is figure out what is the most direct route, if we do want an extension to get traffic down to South County. So, I really think even as directors, we're not supposed to be pushing or directing any kind of alternative until we get through the EIR process.
Then
So
Chair,
think
I
we
need to clarify, my question's totally, I am not pushing that. I am
We'll
not.
ask to have that
My
put on
question
our review.
is, no, my question
did.
is, I wanna know what was taken into consideration for this gentleman to make the statement that it would do nothing to relieve northbound and southbound traffic. That was my question. It wasn't that I want the Beltway. Believe me, I just wanna say for the record, I'm not doing that.
Well, I
Okay,
understand.
and none of my future questions will be about that, it will just be about the survey, which I asked to be agendized, so that I could ask this
To
question.
avoid a back and forth, I would assume, your question was based upon the fact that you want to know what information he had before he
That's exactly right.
proposed the question. But I think, Director Shea is right, we need to stay as neutral as we possibly can, so try to favor one option over the other, and
And
delay the
just for
process.
clarification, if I could, Chair,
Yes.
at a previous meeting, Director Ward did ask staff to put the Beltway proposal into the review. You directly asked for that.
Okay,
So
now
you
you're
can't
going,
back
you're going
down that.
far from this survey. That is not part of what we are talking about in the survey. We're talking about the survey and what it says.
You're
So
making
I'll-
statements,
Well,
I'm
against
not.
what you actually done, so I just wanna clarify.
Let's wrap up that dialogue. Proceed, Dr. Smith.
And again, if this is a residual issue, in a subsequent survey, we have a question format we call the debate block, where we would probably put in those two sides of the issue. Some people say it does, here's why, there's a study, some people say it doesn't, here's why, here's the reasoning, which side is more persuasive, but we didn't measure that here. Okay, we didn't get to that depth in terms of this option. It's the option is as it was defined, nothing more and hopefully
As it was
nothing less.
defined by the TCA to get to
In
management.
the four options, a fourth option was a do nothing, because it is an option. So we said one suggestion would be to do nothing beyond what is currently planned for I-5 improvements. Some claim that current I-5 improvements plus the recent open La Pata extension will provide sufficient traffic relief in South Orange County. The advantage of this option would be no new roadway construction costs or additional community impacts. The disadvantage of doing nothing means that it will continue to increase on I-5 and spill onto local streets in South Orange County. And again, we have the same operative question. Is this option desirable, acceptable, or not desirable? Okay, so we had preceding this block of questions, we asked a couple of behavioral questions and psychographic questions, one of which is we asked about congestion. We asked, do they experience congestion on I-5 in the South County? Often, seldom, or almost never. And you can see better than 4 out of 5 respondents said that they often
North County
see
has
this
bad traffic.
congestion.
You'll agree.
We also asked the question, we said in the future construction, referenced that, the future growth of the county, and we asked them if they thought this growth would have a significant effect, some effect, or little effect on future congestion. And you can see, again, very high ratio. 2 out of 3 respondents thought it would get worse. Okay, and then here's the response to the doing nothing. Desirable, it was only, what's that, 12.5%.
Look at this one, it's BS.
Acceptable would be 29, and we had a majority who said doing nothing is not acceptable. So here's the backdrop that we're painting, okay? And that is, it's a problem.
It's a problem,
They
all
often
right. Yes, we have a problem.
encounter congestion in South County. They think the problem is going to get worse. For half of those people who said it's often a problem, they said it affected their lifestyle. It was more than just an inconvenience. And they said doing nothing was simply not acceptable.
These are not the
So
people
then we
driving
looked
the
at
toll
those four solutions, and we can, one was adding lanes. That first one that I skipped through was adding lanes, and we again talked about the positives and negatives. The positive is that it would increase traffic flow capability on I-5. The disadvantage would be the cost and the eminent domain issue. And of the four options, we're contrasting in this graphic the percentage desirable to the percentage not desirable. And you can see it reduces quickly down to two desirable options, either the through pass or adding lanes. Doing nothing was unacceptable to a majority of the respondents, and the Beltway option was
The
even much
TCA
more
to do nothing
unpopular.
is beyond acceptable, and they should do nothing but pay down
Then,
the bonds.
after we went through those four issues, and there's a block I'm not gonna go through here, it's a little more tedious, where we actually paired them and said, okay, A and B, A and C, A and D, B and C, B and D, D and C and D. And so we had head-to-head comparisons, and in that we got the same kind of results. We had two options that were reasonably popular. The more popular of those was the widening I-5, but not by much. So after we had gone through the four options, then we narrowed it down and said, okay, if the only option you had to vote on was the through pass, would you vote for it or against it? First ballot you can see there is the vote countywide without giving any arguments for or against, simply the descriptions that I already read to you. Then we went through two summary arguments. One summary of the leading arguments for it, the leading arguments against it, and we came back and we asked the same ballot question again. And you saw that the for was still a majority, but it dropped by a couple points. And the opposition was still a majority, but it picked up about 4 points. So we clarified positions for people if they were undecided. And so here's the result if they were only considering the through pass options. And we also asked them, when we gave the support and opposition arguments, we said, are these arguments very convincing, somewhat convincing, or not convincing? The through pass arguments were perceived to be more often convincing than, or very convincing than not convincing. And the opposition arguments were more often seen as not convincing than convincing. So for the group as a whole county-wide, they tended to agree with the arguments for the through pass, but, and it's important to know, given the way the ballots turned out, that those arguments against did arouse opposition among an additional about 4% of the population. So those arguments clarified it for those folks as well. So this was basically kind of a wash in terms of the two ballot tests. Here's a critical piece of information. Bearcat told you that we stratified or established quotas for each of the 5 soup districts, and then we, all of the results in the survey, cross-tabulated this by supervisor district, and you can see in every district in the county, there were more supporters than opponents, and this included District 5, the South County. Now, we're going to see later when we look at the oversample for San Clemente supplied an imbalance by way of opposition, but when we represented San Clemente proportionately than what we had here was, again, even in Soup District 5, you had majority support and a minority of opposition. I'd also note that we found here that a lot of the variables we looked at, demographic variables, psychographic, a couple of those I'm going to talk about, and a host of appended variables that we took off the voter file. I had plenty of data to play with, including a lot of data from questions we didn't even ask that we knew about the voters from the voter file. And unlike most surveys, there wasn't much there in the cross tabulations. Very little was predictive of how people responded to this. So it was not partisan, it was not ideological, it was not, by and large, geographic. Age was not a substantial predictor. Gender was not a predictor. Basically, you had three things that predicted. One was the obvious, how often do I drive on I-5? Am I a commuter? Do I have a pass? Do I use these lanes? There were predictors not as strong as you would expect. Obviously, there are people who, well, I'm never going to use a toll road, but I appreciate the fact that it'll siphon off some of the rest of the traffic. So these were not major predictors. And foremost among those, I think, in terms of theoretical importance, is that countywide, every district came out majority favorable for the through pass option. There were two psychographic variables that I think had some predictive power. One was a question on growth, and we asked a question for the sole purpose of, okay, do you think there should be significant restrictions on future growth, or basically do you think status quo is okay? And it came out about 50-50, maybe a little more for a few percentage points more for the status quo. But when we broke those folks out, the restrict growth people were less enthusiastic than the don't restrict growth. And this was a theory we had going in, that a lot of the opposition is driven by simply, I'm not happy with growth in this county, I'm not happy with what's happening with growth around, say, San Clemente. And that's the basis of my opposition. I also think that attitude kind of explains how you had people, including a lot of people in San Clemente, who said, you know, it's a problem, we got to do something about the problem's going to get worse, I don't want to do nothing, but I'm opposed to the through pass. Okay, how do you reconcile those? Well, I'm unhappy with development and what's happening, and this is my objection to that, albeit somewhat after the fact. And then we did the same thing with environmentalism. Hardcore environmentalists were a little bit more opposed to it, not a lot. And then now I'm talking about what we did when we removed the base sample, except for the San Clemente, and we isolated and we looked at each of those different communities. And I'm not going to go through all of them, most of the results weren't that exciting, but here's what we found in San Clemente. In San Clemente, on the first ballot, we had 72% opposed. We had 25% in favor. After we went through the summary arguments for and against, support dropped a little bit, opposition rose a little bit. So clearly in San Clemente, we had a clear opposition of 3 out of 4 respondents who were opposed to the through pass option after it had been defined, after it had been summarized the arguments for and against. So we did measure clear opposition, but despite that, when we represented San Clemente proportionately to the 5th supervisor district, you still had a majority of that district supporting.
For long.
Okay? That's kind